Up to this point, you may have noticed a pattern in my observations about Donkey Kong 64. A common thread linking just about every critical thought I've had about the game. Compared to its contemporaries, DK64 has been the subject of far more retrospective criticism, and after spending probably 10 times too long thinking about it, I'm reasonably certain it's owed to this one feature of its design. A feature that, in my eyes, ultimately earns DK64 the mixed legacy it has to this day, the 5-character mechanic. And note that I'm not referring to the character-specific collectibles alone, but the 5-character mechanic in general. Before anything else, I think it's important to give the developers some credit for the sheer ambition on display here. Creating an interactive 3D world on this scale, on this hardware, with distinctly themed levels in a year and a half is a grand enough task on its own. To then add 5 playable characters with entirely different models, animations, and a unique set of abilities is something else entirely. And quite honestly, the presentation of the 5-character system is one of DK64's strongest achievements. Each of the Kongs has a clear and memorable personality that's reinforced in just about everything they do. Idle animations, special moves, instruments, weaponry, cutscenes, and of course the infamous DK rap all serve to further their characterization. The character selection screen in and of itself is an excellent example of this. What could have simply been a static menu instead serves as a wonderful showcase of this personality, with musical variation and unique animations for each Kong before, during, and after their selection by the player. This kind of polish is a staple of early Rareware games, and it lends DK64 an undeniable charm. I'd even go so far as to say that the stylization of this mechanic represents the bulk of the game's modern appeal. But ultimately, all of this amounts to not a whole lot more than stylistic flourish. Style can only add so much without substance, and it's here where we run into some serious problems. If the 5-character mechanic has one main failing, if DK64 can be said to have one central, fatal flaw, it's this. The level design doesn't take enough creative advantage of the differences between the Kongs, or more fundamentally, the Kongs aren't mechanically different enough to justify their existence in the first place. A game with multiple playable characters that behave differently from one another typically has two purposes in mind. Allow the player to choose the character who suits their desired playstyle, or use the differences between characters as a puzzle-solving element, requiring the player to figure out the most suitable character for a given situation. Many of these games use a mix of both purposes. Donkey Kong 64, for the most part, uses neither. The player isn't free to choose the Kong they want when exploring the level because character-specific collectibles dictate their character choice for them. And any semblance of environmental puzzle solving is eliminated when the visual cues are reduced to a switch with that Kong's instrument or weapon ammo or face. Even if DK64 gave the player the freedom to pick a Kong that suited them, their individual playstyles are so similar that the distinction is barely worth noting. You may argue that that's the point, and that an open environment requires these characters to move in similar ways to facilitate free movement. You might also argue that the main attempt to differentiate these characters comes in the form of their unique special moves. But that brings us to an even more pressing concern. Most of these special moves aren't unique either. To be more precise, the differences between special moves activated by barrels and pads are incidental parts of the overall experience. They're largely arbitrary aesthetic choices, not functional ones. Does it really matter that the player reaches a certain area by inflating themselves as Lanky rather than spring jumping as Diddy or teleporting or hovering as Tiny? The number of times that these mechanics are used in a meaningfully distinct way are few and far between, and the execution of these few instances is often sloppy at best. More to the point than these mechanical similarities is that the player has no real agency or effort in finding a solution to the problem that makes use of these special moves. Here's a more concrete example, a cabin in Crystal Caves. The cabin has a handful of spotlights. Stepping into a spotlight results in the player being instantly killed. After dodging some moving spotlights to ground pound some targets, a chunky pad appears. This allows the player to turn invisible and reach the bonus barrel in the center underneath a stationary spotlight. At first glance, this seems like a decent, discrete gameplay challenge. However, there's one detail I've omitted that's a sticking point for me. This room is walled off behind a door that can only be opened by Chunky's instrument. It's a game of Simon Says to open the door and get inside, and then a game of Simon Says to reach the reward. The player is never required to think about how to proceed, and the only aspect of this room that uniquely requires Chunky is spoon-fed to the player almost as a reward in and of itself. The spotlights could just as easily be disabled when hitting the final target, allowing any character to reach the bonus barrel, and the room would be functionally identical. The conclusion illustrated by this example is simple. The uses of mechanical differences between DK64's playable characters are superficial at best. And if you think I'm cherry-picking here, we can find examples of these superficial challenges everywhere. The gated golden bananas in Jungle Japes, the 5-door temple and llama temple in Angry Aztec, the 5-door ship in Gloomy Galleon, the 5-door cabin in Crystal Caves, the 5-door igloo in Crystal Caves. You're likely noticing a pattern unique to the 5-door structure. Change to a character, open a door, complete a challenge that quite often any Kong could reasonably overcome, not just the one who opened the door, collect a golden banana, repeat. In this way, the 5-door structure works to create the illusion that these characters are more distinct than they really are. This becomes especially frustrating when you consider that this illusion the game works to create is an unnecessary one. Even if you simply gave the player the option to use the character they like most rather than restricting that choice, these similarities wouldn't seem quite so bad. There are a few areas that already represent a missed opportunity in this regard. DK's room in the 5-door igloo in Crystal Caves has a rotating structure that does enormous damage on contact with its walls. The player has to navigate through this structure and reach the center to get a golden banana. It's a decent enough challenge, and certainly better than the game's endless barrage of press a switch, win a bonus barrel. But imagine if the player entered this room as Donkey Kong and then had the option to change characters. Tiny or Diddy Kong are better suited for this kind of movement puzzle because they're smaller. The simple act of giving the player the ability to make this decision improves this room. For a brief moment, they're no longer just playing Simon Says. The player gets to be creative about solving a problem and is rewarded for that creativity. These kinds of more natural environmental cues do exist to a certain degree, but they're used so sparingly that it's difficult for me to find enough relevant backing footage to even cover this sentence. Calls to action are always far more explicit, and as a result, far less interesting. At this point, I feel like I need to emphasize that everything about Donkey Kong 64 suffers from the implications of this design approach. Almost every puzzle, almost every barrier, almost every set piece, almost every object in the record-setting number of collectibles, almost every single meaningful interaction with the game boils down to 5 keyholes and 5 keys. The presentation of the keyholes might be unconventional, they might differ mechanically on a surface level, but whether it's an instrument, a color, a pad, a barrel, a switch, weapon ammo, or the character's face, the result is always the same. And it all works to establish the gameplay loop that clearly illustrates DK64's most prominent issue. Explore an area, figure out the key you need. Go fetch the key if you don't already have it. Use the key, repeat. The fact that the keys look and dance and sound different from one another can only distract from the game's inherent sameness for so long. Once that illusion falls away, you're left with a game whose design language doesn't seem to have much regard for the player's time or agency. As of this writing, a modification for Donkey Kong 64 has been released that attempts to address this complaint. It allows the player to switch their current character on the fly rather than forcing them back to a tag barrel. While I admire the ingenuity and effort behind this mod, it only goes so far. The biggest issue with DK64's gameplay loop isn't that backtracking to get the key is uninteresting, it's that the steps of figuring out which key you need and using the key are also equally uninteresting most of the time. Exploring a colorful 3D environment can be fun, and DK64 has some decent aesthetics. But even with the elimination of backtracking, what's left is still largely unengaging. So, the big question, easily the biggest question of this series of reviews. How could we possibly improve this? As an aside, my approach here might seem a bit clinical, but I'm a programmer by trade, so defining things as a loop and then optimizing that loop is pretty much my bread and butter. Anyway, as always, I try to keep the context of the game's development in mind when considering constructive alternatives, to keep things within the realm of reality. So let's define a few guidelines to work within. DK64 had a 3-year development cycle, but restarted supposedly from scratch about halfway through. Any huge, sweeping change would probably not be feasible considering how long development had been going up to that point. Changes to this system would instead have to focus on scaling things back and recontextualizing existing features. On the other hand, we don't want to strip the game of its personality, easily its strongest asset, so simply scrapping the 5-character mechanic or making changes that heavily impact its presentation won't do either. And lastly, let's assume that we provide the ability to switch characters anywhere. The player can press a button to bring up the tag barrel menu at any time, except for areas we explicitly disallow it if it proves necessary. With that in mind, let's give this a shot. Our primary goal is to make each of the Kongs feel more unique and purposeful by giving them distinct roles. Ideally, each Kong should have skills related to their well-established personalities or physical characteristics. As in a few other places, the game is actually already more than halfway to this objective, which gives us a good baseline. Here's a chart of each Kong and what each Kong is capable of. As far as unique abilities go, Tiny can cross large gaps and fit in small spaces. Lanky can ascend steep slopes, briefly sprint at high speeds, and stretch his arms to reach long distances. Chunky can lift boulders and destroy obstacles, and Diddy can fly and has a forward dash technique, as well as a completely unutilized double jump. Funnily enough, this leaves Donkey Kong as the least developed of the characters, so to speak. He's able to pull levers, but this doesn't really speak to any aspect of his characterization. We need to give him something unique without adding anything new. In the vein of scaling things back, let's make DK the only character who can pick up and throw barrels. It's hard to imagine a more iconic move in DK's repertoire, so this definitely fits. This introduces a slight contradiction with Chunky being able to lift boulders and not barrels, but this can be resolved in a way that also furthers Chunky's role. Chunky doesn't know his own strength, so if he tries to pick up a barrel, it shatters immediately, perhaps even leading to a flustered and embarrassed animation. Next, while all the Kongs have their strengths when it comes to combat, DK has almost always been characterized as somewhat cocky and eager to prove his toughness. To that end, let's remove all of the weapons except the coconut gun, and only allow DK to use orange grenades. Just like that, DK has become the only character who can activate weapon switches, and he takes on the role of the tank who can be used to deal with particularly tough enemies. Sound familiar? This also allows us to remove the utterly extraneous weapon gates blocking off entire sections of levels. On the subject of removing extraneous gates, let's also completely remove the musical instruments except for Lanky's. The trombone has more contextual uses than other instruments, and also represents the best thematic fit between character and instrument. This choice does run slightly afoul of the don't remove personality guideline, but in a game full of arbitrary barriers and mechanisms completely devoid of any kind of cause and effect logic, the instrument pads are among the worst offenders anyway. Most of them are simply used to gate off entrances, and those gates aren't necessary if we can switch characters at any time. In the few cases where instruments do make contextual sense, it's pretty easy to imagine ways to replace them with character-specific alternatives, or we could simply reassign these situations to Lanky. Instruments are also used as an area of effect attack, but not to any particularly useful end. The fact that the game simply disallows it sometimes without explaining why makes it very situational, and it doesn't really deliver the impact you'd expect for an attack with such a long animation. This is especially true when the powerful enemies that are dispatched by this move often respawn fairly quickly. If we were feeling a bit adventurous, the trombone could instead be used to draw the attention of enemies, which it does in the final battle anyway. This could even be retooled into a puzzle-solving element. In fact, while we're at it, let's give Lanky the ability to pull levers instead of Donkey Kong. Now Lanky has a whole host of unique ways to interact with the environment in specific contexts. Reaching far-off objects, crossing tricky terrain, pulling levers. With this moveset, Lanky fits somewhat neatly into a puzzle-solving niche. Next, we have an opportunity to address the issue of movement. As mentioned previously, all of the Kongs have similar movement and acceleration speeds, likely to ensure that no area ever becomes unnavigable due to character choice. However, if the player has the ability to switch characters at any time, we no longer need to worry too much about this limitation. Chunky and DK can be a bit slower and more lumbering, Lanky's movement could have erratic acceleration. Most importantly though, let's make Diddy notably faster than the rest of the Kongs, and allow him to jump higher as well. This turns him into a de facto running option, similar to the Talon Trot from the Banjo games. This and his ability to double jump and occasionally fly would make Diddy the obvious choice for large-scale traversal. Tiny and Chunky are probably the best realization of existing archetypes as they already are. Tiny is built for exploration, and note that I mean exploration as distinct from traversal. In this context, traversal refers to moving from area to area throughout the level. Exploration, on the other hand, is searching the nooks and crannies, reaching far-off platforms, and the like. In this hypothetical version of the game, Diddy is fast, but Tiny has more dynamic and precise mobility. It's somewhat telling that Tiny already has the only boss battle completely designed around her unique abilities, so we don't really need to change much here. With DK's new focus on combat, Chunky's strength is used less for fighting and more to remove obstacles and solve puzzles. This also feels like a better fit for his personality as a gentle giant, someone with enormous strength who only uses it for combat in dire situations. As for his role, yeah. So we've made some changes to the characters, but these won't amount to much without a few changes in level design as well. Again, we want to focus on changing things mechanically rather than structurally. We're trying to make use of the existing pieces, not build a new game from scratch, so full-on level redesigns are out of the question. First, let's take a look at barrel abilities. Each Kong has a temporary special ability that can be activated by jumping into a barrel with their face on it. They can then use this ability until their crystal coconuts run out, or until they leave an area of effect. Ultimately, this serves as yet another Simon Says design pattern, and some of these are downright insulting. Gee, I wonder what I'm supposed to do here. My proposal to fix this is pretty simple. Make the barrels completely generic. Any Kong can enter a special ability barrel, and it activates that Kong's ability. The player has to figure out from context which Kong to use and what to do with them. It's not a huge change, since usually the context will be reasonably obvious, but this still feels better than mindless picture matching. This change also gives us a chance to retool crystal coconuts, which are possibly the most extraneous collectible in the game. Instead of being regular collectible objects, the player could always default back to 10 or 20 depending on the ability being used, putting a firm time limit on their usage. Crystal coconuts could then appear along the path the player needs to take while using the special ability. This can be used to guide the player to their objective in early levels, or create a challenge in later levels by requiring a dangerous path to avoid running out of time. In fact, let's look at this example again and see how it might be improved with this new approach. First, we'll obviously move the barrel further away. Already, this becomes a bit more interesting. The player now has to fit multiple pieces together, finding the barrel, finding the tunnel, and figuring out how to travel between them as Tiny after shrinking in size. Depending on where we position the barrel, the player may be required to perform some platforming or combat to reach the tunnel. Maybe the area is populated with strong enemies. In this case, the player has to switch to Donkey Kong, clear the area, switch back to Tiny, and then make it to the tunnel from the barrel. Without changing a single piece of level geometry, we've turned something trivial into something perhaps a bit more interesting, with multiple possible angles of execution. On top of that, at least one of these angles requires the use of multiple Kongs, further justifying the 5-character mechanic. Next, let's see what we can do with 5-door structures. With a focus on minimizing major changes to levels, we don't have a ton of options with these. At the very least, we can remove the character-specific gates, since character switching can be done anywhere. This ends up being a pretty big conceptual improvement on its own. In some cases, these rooms have now become semi-organic puzzles, where the player figures out which character to use and switches to them after entering the room and examining their surroundings. In others, the player is free to use whichever Kong they want. In both cases, the player's role becomes more active, and the player's time is no longer wasted switching characters and opening doors 5 times in a row. Overall, these changes can be summarized with 2 main concepts. Change the Kongs to make them more specialized, and change the use of mechanics within levels to give the player more agency. With these 2 changes, we've made the game that much better, right? In all honesty, I can't really say that. I'd love to give myself a pat on the back and claim to have fixed DK64. That would certainly make for a nice clickbait thumbnail. However, I want to stress that these changes can never amount to much more than an educated guess. Even subject to the restrictions we defined earlier, these changes could have huge knock-on effects. They'd require extensive testing, and it's entirely possible that we'd just be replacing one form of tedium with another. After all, is recognizing the presence of enemies or the shape of terrain really that far removed from recognizing shapes and colors and faces? It's hard to say, and again, it's extremely easy to make this kind of high-level sweeping critique 20 years after the fact. When you're not in the middle of the 30th month of development with a looming deadline, and instead looking at a finished product from a big-picture perspective, it's a lot easier to theorize. At the very least, this is one angle you could take at improving the 5-character mechanic. I've certainly thought about it long enough for one lifetime, that's for sure. Before we wrap things up, let's take a look at the end of the game, because surprisingly enough, in some ways it speaks to a couple of the changes I've suggested here. After collecting 100 golden bananas and the boss key from each main level, the player gains access to Hideout Helm. This level represents a surprising shift in level design, as a strictly linear series of challenges. Even more surprising is how engaging this ends up being. From the moment the player enters the level, they're met with obstacles that force them to, if only for a moment, observe their environment and make a quick decision about how to proceed. A handful of linear tunnels gives way to the Blast-O-Matic Room, a towering hub with a handful of doorways branching off in different directions. Disabling the Blast-O-Matic and saving DK Isle involves entering each of these areas and completing a series of challenges structured similar to the bonus games throughout the rest of DK64. Everything I've described so far already represents an improvement over Donkey Kong 64's normal gameplay. Aimless wandering, mental note-taking, and backtracking are replaced with a truly focused progression from section to section. It's structured in a way that genuinely imparts the feeling that these characters are working together, even though each individual problem they solve is completely disparate. Where DK64 bonus games were usually complete non-sequitur, the Hideout Helm barrels are reasonably challenging tests of mechanics that are actually used throughout the game, and almost all of them are specialized to their respective characters. All of this goes a long way to make Hideout Helm feel like an appropriately daunting final test. But what truly elevates this experience is the sense of tension the game creates. A timer constantly ticks down to an instant game over, through menus, cutscenes, and even the pause screen, punctuated every few minutes by K. Rool's ominous laughter. What would normally be a straightforward series of minigames and character choice deductions now has a very potent sense of urgency to it. And all of this is underscored perfectly by music that seems to build ceaselessly in intensity. I feel I have to give some special attention to this song. It does a lot of heavy lifting in reinforcing the sense of tension that the level evokes, and I rarely see it mentioned in discussions of the game's score. The song opens with a literal bang, distinct from the ambient and melodic intros of just about every other song in the game. Before the screen even finishes fading in, a bass drum and a driving monotone bass line establish a moody, tense atmosphere. Both of these persist throughout the entire song, with the bass drum punctuating every 4-bar phrase and introducing every new instrument as they get added to the mix. The bass line serves almost as a sort of racing heartbeat, uninterrupted and unchanging throughout most of the piece. The song also distinguishes itself from the rest of the level themes in how it handles its melody. There's a definite melodic line established early on in the first section, but aside from being doubled an octave above after the first phrase, it never really gets developed or transformed. The rest of the game's tunes lead the player into thinking this melody will be going somewhere, but instead it keeps repeating and falls into the background behind this wavering vibraphone figure. Just as this section seems to be building to something, we abruptly jump into the next section. The initial melody we started with is now completely abandoned until the track loops. The second section replaces it with a slow timpani beat, a literal ticking clock. It also changes up the structure. Instead of being broken into regular 4-bar phrases, it alternates between phrases of 3 and 4 bars each. 3 bars of vibraphone rolls, broken up by 4 bars of descending minor intervals. The bass drum continues to punctuate each phrase, reinforcing this disorienting change-up. To really hammer home the sense of discontinuity, there's one extra bar of rest at the end of this section. After this brief respite, the song starts taking things in a different direction entirely. Where the first half of the piece evokes a looming sense of dread through slower-paced, droning repetition, the latter half seems insistent on never giving the listener a chance to get their footing. They're barraged with rapid-fire changes between sections that constantly ratchet up the tension. First, we have a section of call and response between the strings and brass. With each iteration, the call from the strings grows more frantic and urgent. After just 8 bars, we're thrust into a new section, one that heightens the sense of unease. The bass line, that racing heartbeat of the song, changes for the first time, moving up a whole step and then immediately jumping a very dissonant tritone upward before slowly descending. At the same time, we have 2 melodic lines in the strings that start out mirroring each other, only to quickly fall out of sync both rhythmically and melodically. This, along with the abundance of out-of-key notes, gives a sense of disarray, like the song is coming apart at the seams. This feeling is reinforced when these 4 bars repeat with every note raised a whole step, introducing even more off-key weirdness. For the final section, the strings continue playing a tense, rising melodic line, echoing the first bar of their previous melody, as if trapped in a confined space. At the same time, the brass rejoins and mirrors the bass, playing a series of rising pitches which pair with the strings to reinforce a very claustrophobic feeling. The bass drum doubles in speed and then doubles again. The song swells to a crescendo, the tension rises higher and higher, and... we loop back to the beginning. The song provides zero satisfying resolution to this enormous build-up, which is perfect, honestly. This is the final level, and a timer is ticking down to the end of the world. There's no reason to dial down the intensity. This is a fact clearly not lost on the technical side of the song's implementation either, as it takes priority over every piece of incidental music. Fanfares, special ability themes, and even the tag barrel music all take a back seat, and this sudden mechanical contrast is extremely effective at highlighting the seriousness of the situation. While the song itself may not be an earworm, I think there's a good case for it being the best contextual piece of music in the game. That foreboding timer wouldn't have quite the same impact without it. On the subject of the timer, I mentioned in my reviews of the Banjo games that their trivia quiz shows were particularly effective at providing a final challenge that was in line with their exploratory gameplay. DK64 accomplishes something similar, but to a slightly lesser degree. The use of Snide's blueprints to extend the Hideout Helm timer is a clever idea, and the fact that at least some of them are required to make the level beatable gives them a good sense of purpose. On the other hand, I wish that the game was more explicit about their importance, as the player only receives a single offhand hint about this. By the time the game actually explains their significance, the player has entered Hideout Helm and can't leave. I don't think it's very likely that a casual player will end up stuck with an impossibly short timer. But it is possible, and some more effort to avoid that situation would be worth the comparatively little effort. However, that complaint is splitting hairs compared to the 11th hour runaround the game gives the player after disabling the Blast-O-Matic. I'm not sure why this is such a common feature across the Rareware Collectathons, but after the final gameplay challenge and leading into the final boss, DK64 throws 2 more arbitrary barriers in the player's path. The first requires 4 battle crowns. Just as with the blueprints, the game is very vague about the importance of the battle crowns, to the point that even the instruction manual doesn't specify their use. That said, the threshold is so low that it's hard to imagine a player not reaching it, so it's not that big of a deal. On the other hand, the second door requires the Rareware and Nintendo coins, and it's here where the game actually manages to outdo Banjo-Kazooie in terms of last-minute roadblocks. This requirement is truly baffling to me. It's arguable that the Rareware coin ties into the core gameplay because it's only accessible after collecting 15 banana medals, which requires a lot of exploring and collecting. And to its credit, the game does prompt the player to do this on a number of occasions. But the Nintendo coin is practically an Easter egg within an Easter egg, and the game gives absolutely no indication of where or how to get it. Even if the player approaches the door having only collected the rareware coin, the dialogue intended as a helpful hint points them in the direction of the one they already have. Even putting aside whether or not the challenge of obtaining the coins themselves is meaningful or fun, this has the same inherent problem of Banjo-Kazooie's 94% minimum completion rate. It completely hampers the pacing of the climax for a large number of players. The player has thwarted K. Rool's plan and wants to confront him, and the game even cuts to a special cutscene after opening the Battle Crown door showing an ominous preview of some mechanical monster. To then potentially force the player to slog their way out of the level, back into Frantic Factory, and play through the DK Arcade and Jetpack is just a bizarre choice. And honestly, if we really want this requirement for some reason, why not put the DK Arcade machine right here in the throne room? Aside from fixing the potential pacing issue, it serves as a bit of character humor, suggesting that K. Rool spends his free time playing a video game where DK is the villain. On that note, this is as good a time as any to discuss King K. Rool as an antagonist. The analogy between DK64 and Banjo-Kazooie feels pretty clear in this regard. K. Rool's presence and influence is constantly felt over the course of the game, in a similar manner to Gruntilda in Banjo-Kazooie. In many ways, I like the approach the game takes in its presentation of the character, with brief glimpses from his perspective at the beginning of each level. This is a little more obtrusive than the occasional seamless taunts from Grunty, but is far more effective at painting K. Rool as a more serious threat. His characterization through these cutscenes and the occasional ominous laugh make him feel something akin to a James Bond villain. His face is mostly kept out of frame at first, he's shown openly bemoaning the incompetence of his henchmen, and disloyalty is shown to have violent consequences. Another parallel to Grunty is in the Game Over cutscene. Although, unlike Banjo-Kazooie, we have no hint of levity here. Generally, K. Rool's role as a maniacal villain is played pretty straight, and for the most part he's presented as being above the cartoonish antics of the rest of the game's world. This makes the tonal whiplash of the final battle all the more severe. After freeing K. Lumsy with the final boss key, he effortlessly takes down K. Rool's aircraft. The Kongs enter the wreckage only to inexplicably end up inside a giant boxing arena. Suddenly, King K. Rool has gone from a scheming supervillain to a lumbering buffoon of a heavyweight boxer. His quiet, tempered imperiousness is replaced with bombastic appeals to a loving crowd eager to stroke his ego. And despite how preposterously out of left field this tonal shift is, I can't find it in myself to criticize it. Strange as this may sound, it's a very consistent inconsistency. K. Rool has always been a dynamic antagonist, walking the line between a genuine threat and a whimsical cartoon villain. For example, a lighthearted pirate jingle gives way to a rock song as a genuinely challenging boss bounces around the screen like a pinball. A discordant cacophony scores a battle with Wile E. Coyote hijinks against a pirate captain attempting to flee in his giant helicopter. A mad scientist trapped your friends in a robot made out of his wife's pots and pans. In this sense, from a stylistic standpoint, the final battle of DK64 makes perfect sense. Subjecting this serious, scheming supervillain to wacky slapstick abuse is the entire point. It's just a shame that the fight itself isn't all that it could be. As always, it's important to consider the circumstances of its conception and development. Greg Mayles, the lead designer on Banjo-Kazooie, was called in at the last minute to guest design the final encounter with K. Rool. This likely helps to explain the incongruous nature of the fight and its arena. That being said, I also find it fascinating how well the fight represents a microcosm of the game as a whole. Engaging presentation, competent mechanics, and an interesting use of 5 distinct playable characters, but hampered by bloat and narrowly missed potential. The framing of the fight as a boxing match broken into rounds makes it a natural fit for the 5-character mechanic. Not only does it make good use of each character's abilities, though some are a little contrived, but the fight actually makes use of mechanics in ways that the game never does otherwise. Each Kong taking their turn to unleash their own distinct brand of retribution on the villain very effectively imparts a satisfying feeling of collaboration against a powerful enemy. Unfortunately, the fight is impacted by one major flaw. It's way too long. Even with its dynamically shifting gameplay, the fight starts to feel tedious by the time you've reached Lanky's round. This then gets compounded when you reach Tiny's segment, which is by far the longest and most repetitive. Worst of all is that this makes the consequence for failure completely inordinate. Having to redo the entire fight from the beginning is an absolutely grueling punishment. To be clear, knowing exactly what to do and not dying a single time, this fight took me a full 15 minutes when recording this footage. I don't think it's unreasonable to surmise that new players would likely spend at least 20 to 30 minutes on this marathon of a boss battle. I don't have to imagine the frustration of spending that kind of time only to lose near the end. This isn't to suggest that a long and arduous battle can't be fun, but DK64's approach to it is, again, emblematic of DK64 as a whole. In each round, you go through a series of actions using each Kong's special abilities to damage K. Rool. And then you do it again. And again. And again. The variance between each hit is minor at best, and even though it's undeniably satisfying to finally land that final punch, the fight simply can't justify its length. Let's take a few cues from our earlier design revisions to try to refine this fight a bit. We may have to slightly stretch our no major changes guideline, but we know this fight was a late addition to the game already, so I think this is a little more forgivable. One factor we should be sure to address is the rigid structure of the fight. This poses an interesting problem since some of the existing mechanics depend on events happening in a specific order, and Chunky is clearly intended to deliver the final blow. To the best of our ability, we don't want to alter these mechanics or add new ones. Next, we want to make the fight feel more dynamic on a moment-to-moment basis, and cut down on its monumental length. And lastly, as a final battle, we still want this to feel like a culmination of the experience. It should call on and reinforce the central tenets the game has established up to this point as much as possible. My approach to this is maybe a bit ambitious, but this is a game built almost solely on ambition, so let's go for it. We're going to pare down the fight from 5 phases to 2. This change actually involves a modification to the fight's opening cutscene. As the Kongs psych themselves up and prepare for the battle, Chunky becomes nervous and runs away, leaving the other 4 to begin the fight on their own. The first phase is essentially a rapid-fire combination of the middle 3 phases of the original fight. Remember that in this hypothetical version of the game, the player has the ability to switch characters at any time. Of course, Chunky has run away, so he isn't selectable during the first phase. In addition, the special ability barrels are generic and usable by any character. One of these is placed in the center of the ring, usable at any time. The player will have to do a bit of experimentation to figure out how to fight K. Rool, but the basic progression of the first phase would be as follows. The player uses Diddy to fly up into the rafters and drop a stage light on K. Rool's head. The weapon targets on the stage light would likely have to be changed to make use of Diddy's forward dash instead. K. Rool begins blindly stumbling about the ring, and the player switches to Lanky to activate a far-off switch that has appeared on the edge of the ring. This spawns a barrel, so the player switches to Donkey Kong to pick up and throw the barrel, revealing a banana peel. The player switches back to Lanky and plays his trombone to taunt K. Rool into slipping on the banana peel. Frustrated and embarrassed, K. Rool starts straining to remove the stage light from his head. Up to this point, K. Rool has been constantly moving about and attacking the player from a distance. Now that he's finally standing still and distracted, this gives the player the opportunity to switch to Tiny and enter the hole in his shoe, where the rest of her strange segment plays out as usual, though this would also have to be modified slightly to account for her lack of weaponry. Then, this entire sequence can repeat once, maybe twice, before the end of the first phase is reached. At this point, the Kongs are exhausted and K. Rool seems poised to win in spite of their efforts, until Chunky makes his return and the second phase of the fight begins. And aside from perhaps changing the number of hits from 4 to 3, Chunky's phase doesn't really need to be changed at all from the original. The restructuring already gives it a bit more impact and gives his character a little extra chance to shine. The main drawback of this new approach, and my biggest hesitation in suggesting it, is the impact on the fight's presentation. Although the separation into rounds makes the mechanical progression of the fight feel somewhat stilted, the game has no shortage of that signature Rareware charm. Each round is bookended with an amusing cutscene of K. Rool's henchmen bailing him out by blatantly breaking the rules. The cutscenes are also clear markers for a change in gameplay style. As such, it wouldn't make sense to preserve them if the first phase consisted of the same sequence repeated multiple times. The unfortunate conclusion is that these cutscenes would simply have to be cut in this trimmed-down version of the final battle. Whether or not this trade-off would be worth it is of course up to interpretation, but I think the more dense, tighter pacing justifies the change considering the length of the original. At any rate, with one final punch from Chunky and some confusing interspecies romance, K. Rool is defeated. DK's golden banana horde is restored to its former glory, and peace returns to the island in a fairly uneventful credits roll. And if the player is dedicated enough to have achieved 101% completion, they're treated to a couple of post-credits bonus cutscenes. This includes a somewhat bizarre casting call sequence and blooper reel, but it serves as a nice reward to those with the tenacity to experience everything the game has to offer. For better or worse. Donkey Kong 64, bolstered by marketing and a strong track record from its developers, was something of a phenomenon at the time of its release. A game that had started development as a linear 3D platformer, its pivot to an open-world collectathon format was risky, but its commercial and critical success is undeniable. Over 5 million copies sold, strong review scores, and an enduring fanbase to this day speak strongly to that. In many ways, the game represents a sizable achievement for the N64. Cutting-edge graphics, a memorable score, a collection of massive, varied worlds to be explored, and more than anything else, an aesthetic almost overflowing with Rareware's charming sense of personality through the conduit of its 5 playable characters. All of that being said, there's no point in trying to dance around it. Donkey Kong 64 isn't a well-designed game. It's maybe one of the best examples of a mixed bag that I can think of. Some of its facets exude the polish of other Rareware games of its era, but many others feel haphazardly thrown together. It feels like every inspired and interesting set piece gets counterbalanced by 3 generic cubes with 5 doors on their faces. I'd be remiss not to once again give it credit for being a product of immense ambition. The pieces that make up the game are generally well formed, and in some cases truly excellent. But those pieces simply don't fit with one another. Forcing them together, although an interesting experiment, produced obvious cracks in the game's foundation. The charm of its presentation can only go so far in hiding those flaws. What we're left with is a game that, through just about any critical lens, pales in comparison to those that came both before and after. But I feel like it's important to clarify something here. As of this writing, this series of videos examining these games has been in the works for just over 5 years now. I started this project just as I was beginning my last semester of university, out of what I soon acknowledged to be a pretty childish sense of spite. An initial desire to prove that DK64 wasn't as good as its contemporaries by comparing them to one another. Even by the time I'd finished my review of Banjo-Kazooie a few months later, my goal had shifted. What I'm hoping to accomplish from these videos isn't to prove anything, or even convince anyone of anything. It's easy, and even downright profitable these days, to simply tear down a once-beloved piece of media now that people acknowledge that it hasn't aged gracefully. My choice of wording in referring to these videos as reviews and analyses was very deliberate, in the sense that I'm not trying to tear this game down. An analysis doesn't mindlessly eviscerate a piece, it dissects it, for the same reason we dissect anything: to learn from it. In making these videos, I've learned more than I thought possible about games that were a huge part of my childhood. I've learned to notice things that were designed to be invisible, to respect the care and effort and skill that goes into aspects of design that at first seemed rudimentary from my novice perspective. I've learned and honed skills that'll help not only in critiquing games, but making them someday. I've met and made friends with a great number of talented people who are just as passionate in examining the craft of games, and countless other creative disciplines. And all of this because I got mad when someone in some random Twitch chat half a decade ago said that DK64 was a masterpiece. My point being, despite all I've said in this analysis so far, it doesn't really speak to whether that Twitch viewer was right or wrong. The concept doesn't really apply here, and even if we assume it did, what value would we honestly get out of proving it one way or another? Donkey Kong 64 is a flawed game, but it would be asinine to suggest that people shouldn't enjoy it because of those flaws, just as we wouldn't suggest the opposite because you and your brother really liked playing it every day after school. The point of this exercise in my eyes isn't to invalidate contrary perspectives. All of the positive outcomes in my own life that I just brought up only came about because I examined and thoroughly entertained a perspective that I initially thought was ridiculous, and one that I formally just dismissed out of hand without even thinking about. So, is Donkey Kong 64 a good game? I don't think so. Its merits are outweighed by its flaws by a huge margin, and it can't escape the contradiction of its central conceit and the mechanics that were forced alongside it. But I still appreciate it, for all that it does do right, all that it earnestly tries to do, and most of all, for giving me the opportunity to learn so much from it. Regardless as to whether you agree with me, I hope you feel the same on that point, at least. Well, that should about do it. In my previous video, I'd mentioned making a brief examination of the place that 3D platformers have in modern gaming. The landscape has shifted quite a bit since I wrote that, and this video is already feature length. So unfortunately, that'll have to wait for another time, and probably quite a while. For now, I just have a few thank yous. A very special thanks to Kit Sovereign for invaluable music analysis and editing assistance throughout this series. Thanks to Peppercat for illustration assistance. And lastly, my very sincere thanks to you for watching. Have a good one, and we'll see you next time.